You already know how this ends. That's the thing about the truth. It doesn't arrive. It was there the whole time, sitting in the corner of the room, waiting for you to run out of distractions. Leszek Kolakowski was born in 1927 in Radom, Poland, a city that would spend the next 18 years being occupied, dismantled and bled. He was 12 years old when the Germans arrived. No school, no system, just books from a country house library and occasional private lessons conducted in secret. Because learning itself had been made illegal. He sat his final exams in the underground school system, a child being educated in the ruins of a world that had just proved it could undo itself entirely. And then the war ended, and someone handed him a blueprint. Not a blueprint for rebuilding, a blueprint for a new world entirely. One where the suffering had a cause, the cause had a name, and the name was capitalism. One where history moved in one direction toward justice, and the only question was whether you were brave enough to stand on the right side of it. For a young man who had spent his adolescence watching the old world burn, this wasn't politics, this was salvation. A complete account of everything that had ever gone wrong and exactly how to fix it. He took the blueprint, of course he did. He was brilliant and he was 20 and the rubble was still warm. He joined the Polish United Workers' Party in 1945. He rose fast. By the early 1950s, he was one of the most gifted young Marxist philosophers in Poland. Sent to Moscow on a special program for promising communist intellectuals, he wrote with the precision of a surgeon and the certainty of a man who has found the only answer that matters. The problem with certainty is that it requires maintenance. It requires you to not look too hard at certain things. It requires a kind of disciplined blindness, a daily decision to keep your eyes on the theory and away from the machinery running underneath it. Kolakowski looked at the machinery. That's the whole story, really. A man who was too honest to stop looking, who spent 30 years watching the thing he believed in reveal itself, layer by layer until there was nothing left but the evidence, who then sat down and wrote the most devastating philosophical autopsy of the 20th century's most powerful idea from the inside, with no safety net, in exile. This is the episode about what happens when you actually follow the logic all the way to the end, when you refuse to stop at the comfortable conclusion, when you are honest enough and brave enough and broken enough to write the death certificate for the God you built with your own hands. Kolakowski was the man who knew too much, and he wrote all of it down.
835.
Poland, 1945. The war is over in the way a fire is over. Technically extinguished, but the ground is still hot, and everything that was standing is gone. 6 million Polish citizens dead. Warsaw, a field of ash and exposed plumbing. The country that emerges from this is not Poland restored. It is something new, something that arrived from the east with the Red Army, something that came bearing promises the way conquerors always do. For most people, the choice was not between communism and freedom. It was between communism and the smouldering memory of what came before. And what came before had just murdered 1 in 6 of your countrymen. So you do the arithmetic, you make the calculation, you take the blueprint. Leszek Kolakowski took the blueprint with both hands. Understand what Marxism was for a young Polish intellectual in 1945. Not what it became, not what we know now with the mass graves and the show trials and the whole bloody ledger spread open on the table. What it was then, in that specific moment, to a specific kind of mind. It was a total system. A complete explanation of how the world worked, why it kept failing, and what a human being owed to history. It had the architecture of a cathedral, enormous, internally coherent, capable of answering every question you brought to it. And it was anti-fascist. That mattered enormously. The ideology that had just tried to exterminate Europe had a name, and Marxism named the conditions that produced it. And Marxism pointed toward the world in which it could never happen again. For a boy who had sat his school exams in secret because the occupiers had made education illegal, this was not abstract. This was personal. This was the difference between a world that made sense and one that didn't. He joined the Communist Youth Organization in 1945. He enrolled at the University of Lodz and then moved to the University of Warsaw. He completed his doctorate in 1953, a treatise on Spinoza read through a Marxist lens, under the supervision of Adam Schaff. By 1959, he was a professor and chair of the Department of the History of Philosophy at Warsaw University. He was in his early 30s. He was already one of the most formidable philosophical minds in Poland. And he believed. This is the part that has to land properly. He was not performing. He was not climbing. He was not one of the party careerists who signed the forms and said the words and privately thought about something else. He was a true believer in the oldest and most dangerous sense. The kind where the belief and the intellect feed each other, where the more rigorously you think, the more convinced you become, because you are thinking inside the system, and the system has an answer for everything. In 1950, the party sent him to Moscow on a program for promising young communist intellectuals, an honor, a recognition. He went. But Moscow is where the first crack appeared. That crack produced a question, a small, specific, undeniable question that he couldn't unask. What he saw in Moscow was not the theory, it was the machinery behind the theory, the enormity of the material and spiritual desolation, the gap between what the system said it was and what it actually was, in practice, in bodies, in the faces of the people living inside it. He filed this information. He came home. He kept believing, but something had shifted, the way the ground shifts before an earthquake, not enough to notice unless you are paying very close attention. Kolakowski was paying very close attention. He was always paying very close attention. That was the problem. Back in Warsaw, he continued to write and to teach, and his teaching was electrifying. He had the gift that the best philosophers have, the ability to make an idea feel urgent, to make a concept feel like it had consequences for how you lived your life right now. Students crowded his lectures. His mind was precise and his range was extraordinary. He wrote on Spinoza, on the history of Western philosophy, on the nature of consciousness and freedom. And he kept writing on Marxism, but now there was something else in it, a pressure, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Not rejection, not yet, but interrogation. The difference between a man who believes and asks questions and a man who asks questions he doesn't yet know will destroy the belief. In the early 1950s, he signed a denunciation of Władysław Tatarkiewicz, the distinguished Polish philosopher and historian of aesthetics. This is the moment that does not fit the heroic narrative. This is the corner of the room that the admiring biographies tend to move past quickly. Kolakowski, the brilliant young Marxist, signed his name to the kind of document the system required, an ideological denunciation, the machinery of loyalty turning its gears, a man participating in the very thing he would spend the rest of his life opposing. He later acknowledged it. He never pretended it hadn't happened. That acknowledgement is part of who he was, but the fact of it matters here because it tells you how deep the belief went. Not shallow enough to leave clean hands, but deep enough to compromise them. This is what total systems do. They do not just capture your allegiance. They make you complicit. They give you something to defend that is also something to be ashamed of, and then they use the shame as a chain, because the alternative to defending the system is admitting what you did inside it. The crack that started in Moscow was spreading. He was still in the party. He was still at Warsaw University. He was still, by every external measure, one of the bright stars of Polish Marxist philosophy. But the questions were getting sharper, and in 1956 something happened that made it impossible to pretend the questions weren't there. Something happened that made it impossible to pretend about anything anymore. February 1956. Nikita Khrushchev stands before the 20th Congress of the Communist Party at the Soviet Union and delivers what will become known as the secret speech. For 4 hours he reads from a document that describes Joseph Stalin, the father of the revolution, the architect of the future, the man whose portrait hangs in every office, in every building, in every country that calls itself socialist, as a murderer, a paranoid, a man who built his power on mass graves and fabricated confessions and the systematic torture of loyal party members. The speech is supposed to be secret. Nothing that size stays secret. The crack that started in Moscow in 1950 became a fissure. The fissure became a canyon. And Kolakowski stood at the edge of it, looking down, and did what philosophers do when the ground opens up beneath them. He wrote. The document that appeared on the bulletin boards of Warsaw University in 1956 was short, deceptively short. It was called What is Socialism? And it did not answer the question. It listed, with a kind of deadpan surgical precision, what socialism was not. Socialism, Kolakowski wrote, is not a state where a person who has committed no crime sits at home in fear of the secret police. It is not a state where people are condemned to death for opinions that a few years later become the official doctrine. It is not a state where the history of the revolutionary movement is permanently It is not a state where the history of the revolutionary movement is permanently rewritten to ensure that yesterday's heroes are today's traitors. He kept going. The list was long. The student journal that published it was shut down within days. The essay was torn from the bulletin boards almost as quickly as it went up. But copies moved through Warsaw in coat pockets and briefcases, handwritten, typed, passed hand to hand in university corridors and workers' canteens. The way dangerous truths always travel when they cannot travel openly. It would eventually be translated into English and published in America 3 years later. Poland banned it, but Poland couldn't stop it. This is where a simpler man would have stopped, would have registered the warning, absorbed the cost, and retreated back inside the boundary of what the system would tolerate. But Kolakowski was not a simpler man, and the boundary kept moving, and the question he couldn't unask kept getting louder. In June of 1956, workers rioted in Poznan. Dozens died. The system that was supposed to represent the workers shot the workers in the street. In October, Gomulka was installed as party leader in open defiance of Moscow, and for a moment, a brief, fragile, intoxicating moment, it seemed like the reformers had won, like the thing could be fixed from within. This was the lie that the next decade would slowly, methodically dismantle. Kolakowski was not a revolutionary, he was something more dangerous. He was a revisionist, a man who still believed in the idea and was trying to separate it from the machine that betrayed it. This is the distinction that we have to sit with because it matters. The revolutionary says, burn it down. The revisionist says, the fire is not in the building, the fire is in the people who took it over, and if we could only get the right people, the building would be what it was always meant to be. The revisionist is almost always wrong, and the revisionist almost always knows it, somewhere underneath the argument, in the place where the questions live. In 1959, he published the essay that made him famous in Poland, The Priest and the Jester, two archetypes, two ways of living in relation to truth. The priest is the guardian of doctrine, the one who protects the established answer, who demands that the questions stop at the boundary of the faith, who understands that a community's stability depends on certain things never being interrogated too hard. The jester is the one who will not stop, who asks the question that destabilizes the norm, who knows, and this is the crucial part, that no answer is final, that the moment a truth becomes a monument, it starts to rot. He did not say he was the jester, he didn't have to. He wrote the essay, and every reader in Poland understood immediately which role the party played and which role Kolakowski was choosing for himself. Unfortunately, the system noticed. The decade between 1956 and 1966 is where the psychological center of this story lives. This is not yet the exile. This is not yet the autopsy. This is the longest, most exhausting phase of the whole arc. The one that happens before the break. The one that people who haven't lived inside a total system don't quite understand. Because he was still trying, still writing about Marxist humanism, still arguing that the idea was salvageable if you stripped away the Stalinist perversion of it. Still teaching at Warsaw University, still producing serious philosophical work on Spinoza and the history of Western thought and the nature of religious consciousness. Living a double life not in the way of a spy, but in the way of a man who holds two incompatible truths at once and has not yet found the courage or the clarity to let one of them go. Now, the problem with the revisionist position is it is not dishonest. This is what makes it so punishing. The revisionist genuinely believes that reform is possible. The belief is real. But the belief requires a daily act of selective vision, looking at the idea and not the implementation, at the theory and not the bodies left behind. And every year the implementation makes that harder. Every year the bodies accumulate. Every year the machinery produces new evidence that it is not a perversion of the blueprint, that it is the blueprint running exactly as designed. Kolakowski was running out of ways to not see what was directly in front of him. And then 1966 arrived and a speech was given. And the party's patience, which had never been infinite, finally ran out. The jester had pushed too far. October 1966, Warsaw University. 10 years since the Polish October. 10 years since the brief electric moment when the system seemed to be loosening. When the reformers believed they had won something, when Kolakowski and people like him thought the idea might yet be separable from the machinery. 10 years of watching the machinery win. He stood up and said what nobody else in that room had been willing to say out loud. He accused the government of dictatorial leanings. He said the Polish People's Republic had converted socialism into a caricature of its own ideals. He said the promises of 1956 had not been kept. He said the things that everyone in that auditorium already knew, that everyone in Poland already knew, that the party already knew, everyone knew. And he said them in public with his name attached into the faces of people who had the power to end his career and the will to use it. The room was packed. The speech sent ripples through Polish academia that took years to stop. He was expelled from the Polish United Workers' Party within days. And yet he could still teach. This is the strange half measure of the next 2 years. Stripped of his party membership, but still at the lectern, still at Warsaw University, still in the room. The party had not finished with him yet, or rather it was waiting for a better moment. And the moment came in March 1968 when students across Poland took to the streets, and Kolakowski, who had spent 2 decades teaching those students to think, was not going to pretend he didn't know what that meant or whose side he was on. The authorities dismissed him from the University of Warsaw on 26th of March 1968. His name appeared on a list alongside colleagues from the Faculty of Philosophy. Zygmunt Bauman was among them. The press ran a slander campaign. No references to his work could be made in Poland. He left in November 1968. The system had decided that a man who asked the questions he asked, in the way he asked them, was more dangerous inside the country than outside it. They were wrong about that, but they couldn't have known it yet. Here's where the story changes shape, because exile for most people is the end of something, the closing of a chapter, the moment when the person retreats into survival or bitterness or the comfortable nostalgia of the émigré who keeps fighting a war that has already moved on without them. Kolakowski didn't do this. He went to Montreal, then Berkeley, then Oxford, and he sat down and did the hardest thing he had ever done. He wrote the post-mortem. He started working on Main Currents of Marxism in the late 1960s, still by some accounts holding on to remnants of the revisionist position, still believing or trying to believe that there was a Marxism that could be recovered from the wreckage of what had been done in its name. The writing killed that belief, not because he wanted it to, but because he was too precise, too rigorous, too honest to arrive at any other conclusion. You cannot spend years tracing the genealogy of an idea from its origins to its endpoint and pretend the endpoint was an accident. You can't follow the logic all the way through and then refuse to acknowledge where the logic goes. The 3 volumes were published between 1976 and 1978. They remain to this day the most comprehensive intellectual history of Marxism ever written. But what made them devastating was not the comprehensiveness. What made them devastating was the argument at the center of them. The argument that Stalinism was not a betrayal of Marx's ideas, that the Gulag was not a perversion of the theory, that the mass graves were not what happened when bad people got hold of a good idea. They were what happened when the idea ran to completion. A doctrine that claimed total knowledge of history's direction, that identified a class of people as the engine of salvation and another as the obstacle to it, that subordinated the individual to the collective and the present to the future. This doctrine did not accidentally produce totalitarianism. It carried totalitarianism inside it the way a seed carries the tree. This is the crisis point, not the expulsion, not the exile. This, the moment when the post-mortem is finished and you look at what's on the table and you understand that the patient was not murdered. The patient died of its own internal logic. And you helped build the patient. You gave it years of your best thinking. You signed your name to things in its service. You were, for a crucial decade, one of the most gifted advocates it had. Kolakowski didn't flinch from this. That's the thing that has to be said clearly, because it would have been so easy to flinch. He could have written a book that blamed Stalin, a book that blamed Lenin, a book that said the idea was pure and the execution was corrupt, which would have been a comfortable book that let everyone off the hook, a book that the Western left, which still needed the idea to be salvageable in 1976, would have received with relief. He didn't write that book. He wrote the other one, the one that said the corruption was structural, that the idea was the problem, that the fantasy was the greatest fantasy of the century. He knew too much to write the comfortable book. The philosopher Jürgen Habermas, one of the most prominent voices of the European left, looked at what Kolakowski had produced and said with the grim precision of a man who understood exactly what he was looking at, Kolakowski is a catastrophe for the Western European left. He meant it as a criticism. It was actually the highest compliment. It meant the work was true. It meant that it could not be dismissed or absorbed or argued around. It meant the man had followed the logic all the way to the end in public with his own biography attached as evidence, and what he found there could not be unfound. He had written the death certificate 13 years before the burial. Oxford, All Souls College, one of the oldest, most rarefied intellectual institutions in the world. A place of honey-coloured stone and long silences and dinners where the wine is older than most countries. Kolakowski arrived here in 1970 as a senior research fellow, a Polish exile in a tweed-clad English paradise, and he stayed for 25 years. He did not become English, he didn't become comfortable. He kept writing, he kept asking, and what he began asking once the autopsy was finished was the question nobody expected. Not what do we replace Marxism with, that was the question everyone was waiting for. The obvious next move. The man who destroyed the cathedral must have blueprints for another building. This is what people assumed, but this is not what happened. What Kolakowski asked instead was, why did we need the cathedral in the first place? The Presence of Myth was published in Polish in 1972, 4 years into his exile, while he was still in the middle of writing Main Currents. It's a small book, dense and quiet and almost impossibly strange, coming from the man who had just produced the most exhaustive demolition of 20th century ideology ever written. Because the presence of myth does not argue that we should be free of myth, it argues the opposite. It argues that no human being has ever been free of myth and that no human being ever will be, and that the desire to be free of myth is itself a kind of myth, perhaps the most dangerous kind. Here is what he means, and this is where revelation arrives, sideways, screaming down the alleyway like Akira's motorbike slide, the way revelations always do. Pure reason can answer certain questions. It can tell you the boiling point of water and the orbital period of Jupiter and the most efficient route between two cities. It can build vaccines and calculate compound interest and prove theorems. It is extraordinarily powerful within its domain. But there are questions that pure reason cannot answer, not because we haven't thought hard enough yet, but because they are structurally outside the domain of what reason can touch. Why does anything exist rather than nothing? What do I owe to the people I love? How do I face the fact that I'm going to die? What makes a life worth living rather than merely survivable? These questions are not technical problems awaiting technical solutions. They are the load-bearing walls of a human life, and reason for all its power cannot bear that weight alone. Kolakowski had watched Marxism try. He had watched an ideology built on the claim of total rational understanding of history, attempt to answer every question a human being could ask. The meaning of suffering, the shape of the good life, the nature of justice, the destination of the species. He had watched it produce in practice a system that murdered millions and called it progress, and he had written the 3-volume proof that this was not a coincidence. What he found in the wreckage was not atheism. What he found was something stranger and more honest. The recognition that the whole Marxism left when it died was not a Marxism-shaped whole. It was the shape of the human need for transcendence. It was a silhouette of every question that cannot be answered by reason, standing in the rubble, still unanswered, still making its claims on every person who tried to live without one. He didn't return to religion. This is a crucial distinction. He didn't replace one faith with another or perform the comfortable arc of the disillusioned communist who finds his way back to the church. He doesn't give the audience the conversion narrative they might have found satisfying. He did something harder. He insisted on taking the question seriously without pretending he had the answers. He defended the necessity of the sacred, not because he was certain of God, but because he was certain that a human life lived entirely without reference to the sacred was a life that had amputated something essential from itself. In his 1982 book, Religion, If There Is No God, he examined evil, sin, grace, and the problem of suffering, not to resolve them, but to insist that they could not be dissolved. They were real. They required a framework that pure secular reason could not supply. This is a thought that lands like a stone in still water. Consider what Kolakowski is actually saying. He's saying that the Enlightenment project, the project of reason triumphant, myth abolished, humanity finally freed from superstition and into the clear light of rational self-determination, contains within it a quiet catastrophe. Not because reason is wrong, but because reason alone, left to fill every room in the house, tends to produce either the cold efficiency of a machine or the hot efficiency of an ideology. And ideologies, as he had just finished proving at enormous length, are myths in disguise. They are the sacred returned in secular costume, carrying the same absolute demands, the same intolerance of heresy, the same willingness to sacrifice the present generation to the promised future. Attempts to purge myth in the name of science, he argued, do not eliminate myth. They replace traditional myths with the ideological ones, myths of progress, myths of revolution, myths of the inevitable arc of history bending toward justice. The furniture changes, but the need remains. He came to understand human history, and this formulation is worth sitting with, as a process of the accumulation of unexpected miracles, not a trajectory, not a progress, not a march toward anything, a series of things that could not have been predicted, happening to creatures who needed them to mean something, in a universe that offered no guarantee of meaning at all. This revelation is not comfort. Kolakowski is not offering you a softer mattress. He's offering you something more austere and, in the end, more honest. The recognition that the need for transcendence is not a weakness to be overcome. It's not the residue of superstition that a more rigorous education would eliminate. It is constitutive. It is a part of the structure of being human. The person who has burned their myth to the ground and stands in the ashes declaring themselves finally free, that person has not achieved liberation. They've simply lost a language for the questions that will not stop being asked. This is what he found on the other side of the post-mortem. Not God, not certainty, not peace. The discovery that the questions themselves are sacred, and that the only honest position is to keep living inside them without resolution, without the false relief of an answer, because that is what it means to be human. Here is the question Kolakowski's life actually asks. Not the political question, not the historical question. Not the question about Marxism or Poland or the intellectual genealogy of totalitarianism. Those are the scaffolding. Underneath them is the question that has been waiting since the first sentence of this episode, the one you already felt coming, the one you've been quietly hoping that we wouldn't get to. What is your Marxism? Not literally. I'm imagining you don't have a dog-eared copy of Das Kapital on the nightstand, might be propping up a table somewhere, but you have something. Everyone has something. A framework so load-bearing, so fundamental to the way you explain yourself to yourself, that you have never really examined it. A story about why your life has gone the way it has, why your relationships fail or succeed the way they do, why you're the kind of person that you are and not some other kind. A complete account, a system, something that answers every question you bring to it, which is precisely why you keep bringing questions to it, and precisely why you've never pushed it to the place where it stops having answers. You know the feeling. The slight internal adjustment you make when a piece of evidence doesn't fit the framework, the way you move past certain thoughts quickly, the conversations you avoid having with yourself in the dark, not because you can't have them, but because you know where they lead. You are not ready to go there yet. Kolakowski didn't have the luxury of not going there. That is what his life demonstrates. Not heroism exactly, though it was that too, something more precise. The cost of a particular kind of intellectual integrity. The cost of following the logic past the comfortable stopping point, past the place where most people turn around and go home, past the place where the argument stops flattering you and starts indicting you, and you have to decide whether you're the kind of person who keeps walking or the kind of person who finds a reason to stop. He kept walking. For 30 years he kept walking, and what he found on the other side of that walk was not liberation. It was not the bright, clean freedom of the person who has finally seen through everything. It was something smaller and harder and more sustaining than that. He found that the questions were still there, that they were always going to be there, that the honest response to that fact was not to find better answers, but to learn to live inside the questions with your eyes open. In 1990, at the age of 63, he published a collection of essays called Modernity on Endless Trial. The title is the whole argument compressed to 4 words. Modernity does not graduate. It does not reach a conclusion. It doesn't arrive at the point where the big questions are finally resolved and the serious work of living can begin. The trial is the living. The uncertainty is not a phase you pass through on the way to certainty. It is the permanent condition of a mind that is actually awake. Adam Michnik, one of the intellectual architects of Solidarity, the Polish dissident movement that helped unravel Soviet control over Eastern Europe, said something that deserves to land fully. He said, "Each of us is to some extent Kolakowski's pupil." This was not a compliment about Kolakowski's professorial skill. It was a statement about what it means to have had your comfortable certainties dismantled by someone who loved the truth more than he loved being right. The underground editions of Kolakowski's banned work, passed hand to hand through Poland's clandestine intellectual networks, did not inspire the Solidarity movement by giving it a new ideology. They inspired it by destroying the old ones so thoroughly that the people who read them had no choice but to think for themselves. That is the rarest and most dangerous gift a philosopher can give. Not an answer, the destruction of the false answer you were using as a substitute for thought. And then 1989 came. One by one, the communist governments of Eastern Europe collapsed. The Soviet Union itself began its long final dissolution. The system Kolakowski had written the death certificate for in 1976, 13 years ahead of schedule, fell. He watched it from Oxford. He described it as very gratifying. He didn't gloat. He didn't say he told anyone so. He just kept writing. He was 62 years old and he had 30 more books left in him, and the questions had not become any less interesting simply because one particular false answer to them had finally been buried. This is the resolution. Not a triumph and not a vindication. Something quieter and more durable than either of those things. Kolakowski's life demonstrates, stripped of the historical detail, reduced to the thing that applies to every person listening to this in whatever room they're sitting in, with whatever framework they're carrying. The framework you're protecting, the one you make the small daily adjustments to keep intact, is not protecting you. You are protecting it. And you're protecting it because some part of you already knows that a rigorous examination of it would not leave it standing the way that it is. You know this the way Kolakowski knew it in Moscow in 1950, the way he knew it when he sat down to write What is Socialism, the way he knew it across a long decade between 1956 and 66, when he kept trying to reform the thing rather than interrogate it. You know it the way a person knows something they have decided, for now, not to act on. The cost of seeing clearly is that you have to keep seeing. Not once, not in a single dramatic moment of conversion or reckoning, every day. The clarity is not an event, it is a practice. It is the daily decision to look at a thing you would rather not look at, to follow the argument past the comfortable stopping point, to ask the question that doesn't flatter you, to hold the uncertainty without reaching for the nearest available answer, just because the uncertainty is uncomfortable. Kolakowski died on the 17th of July 2009 in Oxford at the age of 81. He had spent nearly 4 decades in exile from the country that exiled him and then, eventually, revered him. His remains were buried in the Pulaski military cemetery in Warsaw, the city whose university expelled him, the city whose students he taught to think their way to freedom without ever telling them what to think. He did not find the replacement of faith. He did not arrive at peace. He arrived at something better and more honest than peace. He arrived at the permanent willingness to ask. That is the whole inheritance, the whole lesson, the whole thing his life, from the rubble of post-war Radom to the honey-coloured stone of All Souls College, was trying to say out loud. You already know what you need to examine. You've always known. The only question is whether you're ready to be as honest about it as he was. Kolakowski knew too much to pretend that he didn't. The question is whether you do too. Go back to the beginning. A boy in post-war Poland, 12 years old when the occupation started, 18 when it ended. No school, no system, just books from a country house library and private lessons conducted in secret because learning itself had been made illegal. He sat his final exams in the underground. He passed. He went to university. He was handed a blueprint for a new world and he took it with both hands. He couldn't have done otherwise. You understand that now in a way you couldn't at the start of this episode. It was not naivety. It was not weakness. It was the only rational response available to a mind that had watched our old world prove it could annihilate itself and was now being offered a complete account of why, and a complete account of what came next, and a complete account of how to make sure it never happened again. He believed because he was honest, because the belief made sense of everything, because the alternative was the rubble, still warm, offering nothing. The betrayal was not that the blueprint was wrong. The betrayal was that he was honest enough to find out. Leszek Kolakowski spent his life doing the thing that almost no one does, not because they can't, but because they have correctly identified how much it costs. He examined the thing he most needed to be true. He followed the argument past the point where it still flattered him. He wrote the autopsy on the God he built with his own hands, in public, in exile, with no safety net and no replacement faith waiting on the other side. And then he kept going, kept writing, kept asking, kept insisting until he died at 81 in an Oxford hospital that the questions themselves were sacred, not because they had answers, but because the asking of them was what it meant to be fully, honestly, irreducibly human. This is what he leaves you with, not a new framework, not the comfort of a conclusion. He leaves you with the discipline of doubt, the understanding that the most dangerous thing in any human life, in any political system, in any relationship, in any private mythology you've built to explain yourself to yourself, is the moment you stop examining it. The moment the belief becomes a monument. the moment you start defending the framework instead of testing it. The ground is always shifting. The honest response is not to find ground that doesn't shift. The honest response is to learn to keep your balance. The question he leaves open, the one that walked into the room with you and will walk out with you, the one you will feel in the quiet later tonight, is whether you know enough to begin. If something in this episode is sitting with you, if the question we left open is still open and you're not sure what to do with that yet, then good. That's exactly where Kolakowski would want you. Uncomfortable, awake, unable to go back to the version of yourself that wasn't asking. He knew too much to let you off the hook, and so do you now, and that's yours to carry. If you want to keep carrying it with us, you know where to find us. We're on social media on TikTok, Instagram, and X with the handle @TheObservingEye. That's where the short form stuff lives if I can actually remember to bloody do it. Then we've got YouTube, which is youtube.com/@TheObservingEye. You can leave a comment, tell us what part landed, tell us what part broke something, and tell us which philosopher you want us to drag into the light next. I do my best to read everything. And if you want the full experience, no interruptions or adverts, just the ideas and the silence that belongs around them, then the place you're looking for is theobservingeye.com. This is the home of the podcast. Every episode in full has audio and written word and completely ad-free, which we always will be, because we shouldn't let capitalism interfere with our capacity to think openly, and because I fucking hate adverts. There's going to be more Fire and Ice. I'm running this season until Easter, and then I'll be taking a 2-week break, and we're going to move into our next season, which will be the realm of the Psychonauts. I'm looking forward to that one. Might start with Timothy Leary. As always, thank you, you beautiful lot, for taking your time to listen to me today, to spend your attention here, because we all know it's finite, and I hope that there's something here you can take away and, think about going forwards. And I haven't given you all a bloody existential crisis. That happens. Anyway, take care, everybody. Much love, and I'll catch you soon.